In the increasingly turbulent global landscape, the shadow of a trade war looms large over international economic and political dynamics. As tensions rise between powerful nations, smaller countries often find themselves caught in the crossfire, forced to recalibrate trade alliances, renegotiate bilateral agreements, and brace for economic shockwaves. This shift becomes especially challenging when nations pivot from traditional partners to emerging markets seeking stability and growth amidst uncertainty. Take, for example, a recent scenario in which a government heavily reliant on external financing suddenly finds itself confronted with austerity demands tied to an IMF agreement. The specter of a trade war exacerbates the strain. Tariffs disrupt industries, supply chains fragment, and domestic prosperity hangs in the balance. As public sector wages are frozen, healthcare budgets stomped upon, and education subsidies cut, citizens feel the weight. Workers strike, students protest, and even the state's most loyal enforcers begin to question their allegiance. In one such case, a nation's police force, historically seen as the bulwark of public order, marched in protest not over politics, but over livelihood. Their rallying cry, "Enough." This dramatic shift marks a crossroads, no longer content to serve a system that prioritizes debt repayments over living standards. Their stand is a testament to how a trade war, or the threat thereof, can ripple far beyond business metrics, penetrating the very foundations of governance and social order. The narrative unfolding is more than a story of economics or policy. It is a testament to resilience and the redefinition of leadership triggered by adverse global forces. In this opening act, we begin to see how the volatile interplay of debt austerity and an encroaching trade war can provoke unexpected actors into reshaping their nation's destiny. As public unrest begins to swell, it often emerges first from unexpected quarters. Police officers, trained, disciplined, and politically neutral, are typically the last to rebel. Yet during a nationwide backlash against austerity measures tied to international loans, even they found themselves marching. Their grievances were plain unpaid wages, disappearing allowances, and the insult of being asked to enforce a regime that neglected them. This moment echoes the larger backdrop of a brewing trade war as global financial pressures intensify. Tariffs and trade barriers constrict a country's revenue potential, forcing governments into a corner, borrow more, cut deeper, or risk collapse. In this climate, IMF-style austerity packages become the default, squeezing public services and inflaming popular anger. Protests erupted in urban centers in Nairobi, for instance. Frontline officers stripped off their badges in defiance. In scenes that shocked observers, men and women in uniform sworn to uphold authority declared their refusal to participate in a system that had abandoned them. They didn't cry for political change, they demanded basic respect and survival. This mutiny of enforcement reflects a core challenge in managing a trade war-induced crisis. When the system designed to uphold order fractures, what remains of the social compact? How does a nation heal when its guardians withdraw their backing? Behind the scenes, another narrative is gaining strength across the continent: grassroots leadership that refuses to bow to austerity or trade pressure. Driven by authenticity and immediate need, this alternative demonstrates that amid global economic tumult, communities can choose another path, one not built on decrees or tariffs, but on listening, solidarity, and mutual care. In a world rattled by trade shocks and fiscal strain, this quiet movement offers a radical contrast and a glimmer of hope. In contrast to states torn apart by austerity and global pressure, there are emerging stories of a different kind of leadership that rejects the demands of a trade war and instead embraces grassroots empowerment. Take, for instance, a young military captain in Burkina Faso who stunned observers by walking away from conventional authority. In a bold act of defiance, he refused an IMF-led loan package that many said was a necessary lifeline during a trade war-induced economic downturn. Rather than delivering speeches from podiums or issuing press statements, he sat barefoot among villagers at a community education fair. "We don't need loan conditions, we need living conditions," he said simply. The nation fell silent, not in fear, but in recognition. Those few words transcended policy, resonating deeply because they named what people had felt but never heard. What followed was not orchestrated by the state nor broadcast by mainstream media. Farmers in small towns began donating supplies for weekend classes. Students raised makeshift classrooms in abandoned buildings. Engineers restored water pumps and public lighting at no cost. Teachers continued lessons under trees, scribbling on scrapboards. These acts weren't the result of funding or top-down directives. They came from the recognition that they were seen, heard, and trusted. As a trade war rattles economies and imposes austerity across borders, such spontaneous unity becomes more than symbolic. It becomes a form of resistance. Schools, clinics, and community services no longer depend on IMF conditionalities or tariff schedules. Instead, they rely on mutual cooperation and human goodwill. Back in Kenya, the approach could not have been more different. Government leadership meeting the terms of international lending prioritized compliance with a trade war-driven austerity regime. Public sector wages froze, VAT on essentials increased, and citizen trust eroded. While protesters chanted, "We are not poor, we are punished," their rage met only riot shields and tear gas. The contrast couldn't be starker. One leader demanded obedience through decrees, the other inspired action through empathy. One government sacrificed dignity to maintain financial credibility, the other invested in trust to shore up resilience. The difference is not theory, it is visible in every self-built school, community clinic, and volunteer health unit rising in adversity. These are the foundations of a different future, one resilient to global shocks like trade war, rooted in social trust rather than fraying institutional dependence. As the effects of a global trade war deepen, nations face critical decisions. Do they follow externally imposed reforms or dare to chart independent paths grounded in trust and community? In Burkina Faso, the decision came through those who felt unheard most deeply, villagers, farmers, youth, and educators responding organically to a leader who listened rather than lectured. Without relying on IMF funds or foreign investment, the country's population took ownership, mothers baking bread cooperatively, farmers sharing seeds, blacksmiths teaching trades to teens. These actions weren't funded, they were fueled by faith. In a trade war context where external trade and funding often determine national direction, this internal solidarity became a lifeline. Contrast this to Kenya's path locked into external agreements strapped by higher tariffs and debt obligations. The state doubled down on austerity. Civil servants marched, students protested, nurses mourned unpaid salaries, and the police, their last bastion of order, flipped first. Yet the government's response remained mechanical suppression, not empathy or engagement. This divergence reveals a provocation. Leadership isn't tested only by the size of one's wallet, but by one's willingness to give voice to the voiceless. In a trade war where financial leverage becomes the tool of influence, the courage to listen becomes the catalyst for genuine resilience. When a community teaches itself, builds its own systems, and shares responsibility, it insulates itself from external economic shocks. That is the quiet revolution, not defiance of trade barriers, but defiance of dependency. It's a belief that sustainable development begins not in boardrooms, but in backyards. In the broader narrative of African resilience, the dichotomy between Kenya and Burkina Faso illustrates more than economic divergence. It showcases a philosophical rift in responding to the pressures of a trade war and foreign financial domination. Both nations, confronted with budget shortfalls, inflation, and rising public anger, face similar structural challenges. But while one sought legitimacy through compliance with global lenders, the other found strength in reconnecting with its people. In Kenya, the government's decision to borrow over $9 billion from global institutions since 2021 came with harsh strings attached. Austerity followed, subsidies, taxes increased, and civil servants left unpaid. As inflation spiked and the cost of basic goods doubled, trust in leadership plummeted. What made this even more volatile was the timing. At the height of a global trade war, where export routes were compromised and import costs surged, Kenya's economy, dependent on external trade and financial aid, became increasingly fragile. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traore chose a radically different approach. Faced with the same economic headwinds and rising costs exacerbated by the trade war, he rejected IMF loans outright. His refusal wasn't just economic, it was symbolic. By stepping away from traditional rescue mechanisms, he invited the people into the solution-making process. Rather than fear, collapsed communities mobilized, farmers turned sheds into schools, engineers repaired local infrastructure with salvaged parts, students taught peers without official sanction or pay. Women formed local co-ops to produce bread using native grains, cutting dependency on imported wheat, made more expensive by the trade war. Even as Western credit agencies downgraded Burkina Faso's ratings and aid froze in retaliation, the nation didn't spiral, it adapted. This is the heart of the story, a people who acted not because they were commanded, but because they were trusted. Traore never offered miracles or quick fixes. He asked questions, sat with his citizens, and refused to outsource the nation's dignity. That trust spread like wildfire, enabling a decentralized rebuilding of systems, education, health, agriculture, all reimagined through local initiative. By contrast, in Kenya, anger built as citizens were excluded from dialogue. Riot police became protesters. Teachers, nurses, and students formed the backbone of demonstrations, not to demand luxury, but to reclaim survival and dignity. Their leaders remained distant, citing fiscal discipline and international obligations over human cost. This contrast between participatory recovery and imposed austerity makes one truth starkly clear: in times of trade war, where nations are squeezed from all sides, the most enduring leadership is the one that trusts its people. Not with slogans, but with shared burdens and collective agency. Burkina Faso's path is not free of hardship, but it offers a blueprint of how sovereignty can be rebuilt not through defiance alone, but through community-rooted resilience. It is a reminder that in a world rocked by trade, real revolution isn't waged through weapons or ballots, it's built through belonging. The unfolding stories in Kenya and Burkina Faso offer more than contrasting political strategies. They deliver a profound lesson on leadership, sovereignty, and the power of public trust during times of economic turbulence. Both nations confronted immense challenges shaped not only by domestic issues, but also by global forces most notably the far-reaching consequences of a trade war. In Kenya, austerity was enforced in response to international lending obligations, a situation worsened by the global economic instability caused by the trade war. With exports weakened, imports more expensive, and inflation surging, the Kenyan government turned to the IMF for financial rescue. In return, it accepted strict conditions, increased taxes, frozen wages, and reduced public spending. But instead of stabilizing the nation, these measures ignited a firestorm of civil unrest. Citizens from all walks of life, students, teachers, civil servants, and even police officers took to the streets, not only to demand their salaries or oppose taxes, but to reclaim their right to be heard. Their message was not just political, it was existential. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, facing a similar storm of rising costs and reduced foreign investment due to the ongoing trade war, a different path was taken. Captain Ibrahim Traore's leadership rejected the IMF's conditional loans and instead relied on a deep well of civic trust. By refusing to play by the conventional rules of international finance, he signaled to his people that their dignity was not for sale. The results were stunning, not in grand economic achievements, but in the everyday acts of unity: farmers giving land, teachers teaching without pay, engineers fixing utilities out of sheer commitment. What separates these two paths is not resources or strategy, but principle. In Kenya, leadership chose compliance to external powers, hoping austerity would eventually yield results. In Burkina Faso, leadership chose community, and the community responded not with rebellion, but with resilience. When a trade war forces the hand of smaller nations, those nations face a choice: yield to external pressure or lean into internal strength. The case of Burkina Faso shows us that sustainable development does not require endless borrowing or the illusion of stability tied to debt. It requires trust, genuine, grounded, and reciprocal. It shows that in moments of global economic aggression, like a trade war, the most potent form of resistance is unity, born from trust, not coercion. As the world continues to navigate complex geopolitical tensions and financial uncertainty, Africa's path forward may not lie in mimicking external models, but in rediscovering its own capacity for self-reliance. The contrast between Kenya and Burkina Faso is not just about governance, it is about vision. In a time when trade wars threaten to destabilize economies and fracture societies, the continent must decide: will it be led by those who demand sacrifice without explanation, or by those who walk barefoot among their people asking the right questions? In the end, perhaps the most powerful act of leadership is not in commanding a crowd, but in inspiring it to move, build, and believe. From a strategic standpoint, the narratives emerging from Kenya and Burkina Faso reflect two vastly different responses to the same geopolitical pressure: the shifting global order fueled by economic instability and the long shadow of a trade war. Both countries were caught in a moment when international financial systems tightened and traditional economic lifelines, such as foreign aid and trade agreements, became increasingly conditional. Strategically, Kenya chose the path of alignment with global lenders, particularly the International Monetary Fund. The logic was straightforward: maintain macroeconomic credibility, secure immediate funding, and uphold the structural reforms demanded by international markets. However, this alignment came at a heavy price: domestic unrest, eroding public trust, and a weakened state-citizen relationship. As the government implemented IMF-recommended austerity measures during a global trade war, it effectively alienated its own population. Kenya's strategy prioritized short-term external approval over long-term internal cohesion. Burkina Faso, under Captain Ibrahim Traore's leadership, executed a drastically different strategy. Instead of appealing to global institutions for rescue, Traore turned inward, activating local resilience through participatory governance. His decision to refuse IMF loans in the context of a trade war was a high-risk move. Strategically, it signaled to the international community that Burkina Faso would not compromise its sovereignty for short-term relief. But domestically, it unleashed a wave of civic mobilization, proving that when a population is trusted, it can become its own strategic asset. From a geopolitical lens, Traore's move challenged the orthodoxy of dependency that many post-colonial African states have been trapped in. In rejecting international financial assistance, Burkina Faso exposed the fragility of a system that equates fiscal discipline with submission. The realignment of power away from lenders and toward the people was not just symbolic, it was a recalibration of strategy that placed faith in human capital over monetary credit. In an era shaped by trade wars where economic alliances are shifting and nations must safeguard their independence, this grassroots approach may prove more sustainable. Furthermore, the strategic ripple effect of these two approaches cannot be ignored. Burkina Faso's model offers a potential blueprint for other African nations, looking to assert sovereignty without succumbing to punitive financial policies. It challenges the assumption that African countries must sacrifice social welfare to appease foreign creditors. Kenya's turmoil, on the other hand, serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of blind fiscal obedience during a trade war. Strategic planning that excludes the populace, no matter how technically sound, is bound to collapse under the weight of mass discontent. Ultimately, the strategic question for African leaders is: This in the face of global trade war, do you anchor your nation to external benchmarks of success, or do you invest in internal strength and citizen engagement? The answer will determine not just economic outcomes, but the very nature of governance across the continent. The contrasting developments in Kenya and Burkina Faso offer a deep reservoir of strategic, economic, and human insights, particularly when viewed through the lens of global economic stress and the impact of the ongoing trade war. At first glance, both nations encountered similar challenges: rising costs of living, diminishing public resources, increasing social unrest, and external pressure from financial institutions. However, their drastically different responses reveal critical lessons for governance, sovereignty, and community empowerment in the global South. The first and perhaps most profound lesson is that trust in leadership is not derived from international validation, but from local engagement. Kenya's government, by choosing to comply fully with IMF austerity programs, alienated its population. The IMF loan taken in the wake of a global trade war came with familiar conditions: increased VAT cuts in public spending and reduced subsidies. These measures, though standard in the global financial playbook, were poorly received by a population already struggling under economic pressure. What's more, the lack of dialogue or participatory planning exacerbated the alienation. Leaders spoke to creditors, not citizens. This created a vacuum of trust and sparked massive protests with the unprecedented participation of law enforcement officers. The protectors of the state became its loudest critics. This reversal illustrates a key lesson: when people are not consulted, especially during times of crisis, even the pillars of order can crumble. By contrast, Burkina Faso demonstrated the transformative power of participatory leadership. Faced with the same global economic headwinds amplified by the trade war, including soaring import prices and declining aid, Captain Ibrahim Traore made a different choice. He rejected external funding conditioned by austerity and instead leaned into community-led development. His approach proved that governance rooted in trust can mobilize an entire nation. People responded to being seen and heard. Farmers donated land, engineers restored utilities, teachers continued to educate even without pay. This level of civic engagement is not born of convenience or coercion, but of faith, a lesson far more powerful than any fiscal policy. A second lesson is that economic resilience can be cultivated from within even during a trade war. Kenya's reliance on foreign loans made it vulnerable not just to the IMF's conditions, but also to global market fluctuations. When the trade war intensified, disrupting supply chains and increasing import costs, the country lacked a buffer. By contrast, Burkina Faso adapted by focusing on self-sufficiency. Local farmers substituted imported wheat with native grains. Schools used chalkboards salvaged from abandoned classrooms. Communities shared knowledge and resources, not because they were told to, but because they were inspired to. These actions, though small in scale, collectively built a national resilience that outlasted financial downgrades and aid suspensions. Third, the concept of leadership itself must be redefined. The traditional model, elite figures issuing orders from podiums, is no longer effective in environments shaped by volatility and global economic confrontation. A trade war not only tests a country's economic foundations, but also challenges the legitimacy of its leadership. When Kenya's president responded to growing unrest with speeches and riot police, it only deepened public frustration. The government's inability to adapt its strategy or share its decision-making process revealed a critical flaw in top-down governance. On the other hand, Traore's barefoot meetings with villagers and open forums with students demonstrated a leadership model rooted in humility and service. His refusal to speak over his people and instead speak with them became a revolutionary act in itself. The lesson here is clear: legitimacy is not a product of force, but of connection. Another vital takeaway is the importance of narrative in shaping national morale. Kenya's crisis was widely perceived as a failure of the state. Protesters held signs reading, "We are not poor, we are punished," framing their suffering as a result of government betrayal. The state's silence and defensiveness allowed despair to grow. In Burkina Faso, the narrative was different. Despite economic hardship, the message was one of mutual responsibility. Citizens didn't wait for permission to act. They initiated projects, trained others, and rebuilt broken systems with what they had. The narrative was not one of victimhood, but of agency. During a trade war where a country's economic narrative is often shaped by foreign media and credit ratings, reclaiming that narrative internally becomes a powerful act of sovereignty. Furthermore, education emerged as a central theme in both crises, but with contrasting outcomes. In Kenya, budget cuts shuttered schools and silenced classrooms. Students took to the streets not to protest bad grades, but to demand a future. In Burkina Faso, education became a tool of resilience. Makeshift classrooms were built, peer-to-peer tutoring flourished, and even blacksmiths joined the cause by teaching practical skills. Education was no longer a service delivered by the state, it became a shared mission. This underscores a vital point during times of crisis, especially in the shadow of a trade war. Education should not be paused, it should be amplified, even reimagined. One of the most subtle but powerful lessons is the idea that governance must evolve from enforcement to example. Kenya enforced policies using authority. Burkina Faso inspired participation through example. When communities act without incentives, when people show up without being told, that is not a sign of loyalty. It is a sign of belief. And belief, once activated, becomes the most sustainable force a country can possess, especially when external forces such as a trade war seek to destabilize it. Lastly, these two case studies challenge the assumption that financial aid is the ultimate solution. In many parts of the world, foreign assistance is seen as a lifeline. But both Kenya and Burkina Faso show us that aid tied to strict conditions can backfire. Kenya's dependence on such aid deepened its crisis. Burkina Faso's rejection of it led to a brief financial siege, but also awakened a new sense of national purpose. The lesson here is not to reject aid altogether, but to rethink its terms. Aid should support sovereignty, not override it. In conclusion, Kenya and Burkina Faso stand as mirror reflections of how countries can respond to economic crisis during a global trade war. One path led to despair, the other to dignity. These stories teach us that leadership built on empathy, strategies grounded in community, and policies shaped by inclusion are not just moral choices. They are strategic imperatives. In a world increasingly shaped by economic confrontation, the greatest defense a nation can build is the belief of its people. From the vantage point of the United States, the events unfolding in Kenya and Burkina Faso offer a stark reminder of how American foreign policy, trade dynamics, and economic influence intersect with the domestic stability of other nations, especially during a trade war. For many American observers, the crises in both countries highlight a complex question: what role should the U.S. play when the instruments it supports, such as international financial institutions and global trade regimes, create unintended political and social consequences? First, the average American might not follow the granular details of African debt or civil protests. However, within diplomatic, academic, and think tank circles, the conversation is increasingly focused on how U.S.-backed financial systems, particularly the IMF and World Bank, influence economic policy abroad. Kenya's experience, for example, became a case study in what happens when economic orthodoxy is enforced without sufficient local consultation. American analysts noted that the IMF's policy prescriptions, familiar tools of structural adjustment, were met with rebellion, not compliance. In a time of global trade war, such prescriptions seem more rigid than adaptive. American policymakers, especially those focused on foreign affairs and international development, are now asking, are we, through our support of institutions like the IMF, exacerbating unrest in regions already vulnerable to the ripple effects of global trade tensions? The trade war between the U.S. and China, for example, had consequences far beyond Washington and Beijing. As tariffs increased and supply chains shifted, developing economies in Africa found themselves grappling with skyrocketing import costs, decreased foreign direct investment, and weakened currencies. Kenya, heavily reliant on imports and foreign loans, bore the brunt of this pressure. American policy experts acknowledge that while the intentions of U.S. foreign policy are rooted in stability and development, the impact can sometimes fuel the opposite, especially when those policies are wielded through multilateral lending frameworks without flexibility. In contrast, the American public's reaction to Captain Ibrahim Traore's leadership in Burkina Faso has been notably divided. On one hand, some American commentators admire his grassroots approach, seeing it as a refreshing divergence from the typical authoritarian posturing seen in fragile states. His rejection of IMF loans in favor of community mobilization resonates with American ideals of self-reliance, civic participation, and democratic dialogue. On the other hand, conservative and financial sectors in the U.S. view his actions with skepticism. From a Wall Street perspective, Burkina Faso's defiance poses a risk to global credit markets. The country's credit downgrade and its friction with foreign investors were widely reported in U.S. financial media as signs of instability rather than innovation. Still, many American scholars and human rights advocates argue that Traore's model may offer long-term stability precisely because it reduces dependence on external debt. They point to America's own founding values, local governance, fiscal autonomy, and community-based action as parallels. In fact, the American Revolution was itself a revolt against external economic control. Some argued that what Burkina Faso is doing now is, in principle, aligned with early American ideals, challenging distant powers, investing in education, and prioritizing the will of the people over elite agreements. In the context of a trade war where economic independence is increasingly difficult, Traore's defiance becomes symbolic. At a policy level, U.S. officials are caught between pragmatism and principle. The U.S. supports the IMF and World Bank because these institutions have historically stabilized global markets. But when those same institutions provoke unrest or foster inequity, America's global image suffers. The scenes of Kenyan police officers removing their badges and protesting unpaid wages became viral on American social media. Activists and journalists questioned how U.S. taxpayer contributions to international institutions were being used to enforce austerity in developing nations. These concerns were amplified by the optics of a global trade war which had already created divisions within the U.S. political landscape. There is also an increasing recognition that American foreign policy in Africa must move beyond transactional diplomacy. Both Kenya and Burkina Faso reveal that aid without agency investment, without inclusion, and reform without respect for local context are no longer tenable strategies. American development agencies such as USAID are beginning to rethink their engagement models. Many believe that supporting bottom-up initiatives like the community schools and co-ops emerging in Burkina Faso may yield more sustainable outcomes than top-down funding conditional on macroeconomic reforms. In American universities, the case studies of Kenya and Burkina Faso are being discussed in international relations courses, economic development seminars, and public policy forums. Students and professors alike are debating the efficacy of debt-based development models in a trade war world. The term sovereign dignity is becoming more common, replacing the older frameworks of aid dependency. Traore's leadership style is being analyzed as a new archetype, one that blends populist humility with strategic national planning. Among the American diaspora, especially African Americans and Pan-African advocates, Burkina Faso's story has sparked renewed interest in alternative governance models in Africa. Social media platforms are flooded with discussions praising the country's resilience. Many see in Traore a figure who breaks the mold of Western-aligned leadership. His barefoot diplomacy and emphasis on local empowerment resonate deeply with communities that have historically been marginalized or disenfranchised. The American response in this sense is not just political, it is emotional. It's a yearning for leaders who lead by example rather than decree. Meanwhile, Kenya's crisis is viewed with a mix of concern and frustration. There is sympathy for the protesters and disdain for what is perceived as a government more loyal to foreign lenders than its own citizens. The images of tear gas and riot police clashing with youth in Nairobi are seen by many Americans as a cautionary tale. It reminds the public that democracy without equity and stability without dialogue are hollow. In conclusion, the American perspective on these two African stories is multidimensional. There is admiration for Burkina Faso's boldness, concern over Kenya's unraveling, and growing awareness that U.S. influence, whether through trade diplomacy or finance, has real consequences. The trade war has taught Americans that economic battles are never contained to borders. They spill into schools, hospitals, and homes across the world. As Kenya and Burkina Faso continue to chart their courses, the United States must reflect deeply on what kind of partner it wants to be, one that enforces stability from the top down, or one that empowers it from the ground up. The audience response to the stories of Kenya and Burkina Faso has been passionate, diverse, and emotionally charged. Across comment sections, forums, and social media, viewers and readers have voiced their admiration, frustration, and hope. The most striking theme in their commentary is a deep yearning for leadership that listens and responds to real human needs. The contrast between Kenya's turmoil and Burkina Faso's quiet resilience has ignited a broader discussion among global audiences about the meaning of governance, dignity, and sovereignty, especially during a time of global economic instability and trade war. Many viewers expressed shock and dismay at what they witnessed unfolding in Kenya. The imagery of police officers removing their badges, of teachers protesting unpaid wages, and of students arrested for demanding affordable education stirred anger and sorrow. For some, Kenya's situation was a bitter confirmation of what happens when governments prioritize international creditors over their own citizens. One commenter wrote, "How can a nation survive when even the police say they've had enough?" Others echoed this sentiment, calling the state's response riot shields and tear gas an insult to the very people who make up the country's future. In their eyes, Kenya became a symbol of what happens when leadership disconnects from its people and aligns itself too closely with global financial mandates during a trade war. In contrast, reactions to Captain Ibrahim Traore's approach in Burkina Faso were overwhelmingly positive. Many viewers said they were inspired by his humility and willingness to stand among his people. The fact that he refused IMF loans and instead chose to trust in the strength of community action resonated deeply. A viewer commented, "This is the first time I've seen a leader who doesn't hide behind a podium but actually listens to the people." Others noted that Traore's simple sentence, "We don't need loan conditions, we need living conditions," should be printed in history books. It captured something they felt had been missing in global politics: honesty. A recurring thread in the commentary was the comparison of responses to the trade war. Many viewers from Africa and beyond pointed out that global economic shifts were not just hurting major powers, but also crushing smaller nations caught in the crossfire. A South African commenter wrote, "The West's trade war with China might seem distant to them, but here it means food prices go up, hospitals run out of supplies, and our leaders are forced to beg for loans." This statement was liked and shared thousands of times, reinforcing the idea that economic policies made in Washington, Beijing, or Brussels have ripple effects that directly impact livelihoods across Africa. What made Traore's leadership so compelling to the audience wasn't just his rejection of the IMF, it was what happened afterward. Viewers were amazed by how citizens took initiative in the absence of formal funding. A viewer in Ghana posted, "When students teach each other without being paid, when farmers donate land to build schools, that's not just resilience. That's what real nation building looks like." Others commented that these actions reminded them of their own community's potential if only given the chance to lead themselves. The grassroots response in Burkina Faso was described not as rebellion, but as rebirth. Many American and European viewers joined the discussion, reflecting on their own government's role in shaping these outcomes. Several questioned why financial institutions, often backed by their home countries, continued to enforce rigid loan conditions, even during crises caused by a global trade war. One British viewer asked if these loans come with strings that cut hospitals and schools, are they really helping? This prompted debates around whether international lending is truly benevolent or simply a tool of control. Others argued for reforming how institutions like the IMF and World Bank operate, suggesting they consider alternative models rooted in participatory budgeting and localized economic planning. There was also a strong emotional response to the imagery presented in the reports. Traore walking barefoot among villagers, sitting with children in dusty schoolyards, and turning off fans in schools so no one would suffer alone. These moments struck a deep chord. One commenter said, "This is what leadership is. Not flying around the world asking for aid, but staying home and asking your people how you can serve them." Others shared personal stories of times when they felt ignored by their own leaders, using Burkina Faso's story as a beacon of hope. The visual contrast between tear gas in Nairobi and cooperative bakeries in Kaya became symbolic of two different Africas, one trapped in cycles of debt, the other cautiously forging a new path forward. There were, of course, dissenting voices. Some viewers questioned whether Burkina Faso's strategy could succeed in the long run without international support. They warned that rejecting IMF loans during a trade war could isolate the country economically and lead to a collapse in services and infrastructure. One viewer said, "Inspiration is powerful, but you can't build a nation on goodwill alone. Sooner or later, the lights go out." Others worried about the potential for foreign backlash, noting that international credit ratings had already downgraded the country and that aid packages had been frozen. However, these critical voices were often met with counter-arguments, emphasizing long-term sovereignty over short-term stability. Perhaps the most hopeful aspect of the audience commentary was the growing belief that something different is possible. Many viewers across continents expressed a desire to see their own countries learn from Burkina Faso's example. Some called for local leaders to abandon the politics of dependency and start investing in citizen-led initiatives. A Nigerian commenter said, "If we just had one leader who believed in us the way Traore believes in his people, Nigeria would change overnight." Others began organizing online discussions, petitions, and even crowdfunding campaigns inspired by what they had seen. Ultimately, the audience did not just react to a political contrast, they responded to a moral one. They saw two futures, one where nations obey global markets at the expense of their people, and another where leaders trust their citizens to become the architects of recovery. The trade war became more than an abstract economic term. It was seen as a force shaping lives, choices, and revolutions. In this context, the real question wasn't just about Kenya or Burkina Faso, it was about what kind of leadership the world is hungry for. In their comments, voices emerged from every corner of the globe, united not by ideology, but by a shared craving for dignity. The stories of these two countries stirred something deep, something long buried beneath bureaucracy, debt, and silence. The audience wasn't just watching, they were imagining. As the narrative continued to circulate, audience engagement deepened. Beyond emotional reactions, viewers began drawing parallels between the situation in Africa and conditions in their own countries, particularly as the trade war reshaped labor markets, supply chains, and public trust across continents. Some Americans, especially those in underfunded rural communities, saw echoes of Burkina Faso's resilience in their own grassroots efforts to rebuild education, healthcare, and infrastructure without state support. "What they're doing in Burkina Faso, we've been forced to do here," wrote one viewer from West Virginia. "We teach each other, feed each other because the system's forgotten us too." This sense of solidarity extended globally. From Brazil to India, from the Philippines to Poland, people commented that they felt seen in these stories. Many recounted their own struggles with leaders who spoke the language of fiscal responsibility, but ignored the cries of the public. One user from Southeast Asia remarked, "Kenya's story isn't African, it's global. Every time we accept a loan with austerity clauses, we sign away part of our freedom." These comments underscored a widening awareness that the economic structures reinforced by a trade war don't simply harm national treasuries, they fray the social fabric. Some educators chimed in, using the footage from Burkina Faso's community-run schools as teaching material. A Canadian professor commented, "I showed this video to my class on post-colonial economics. For the first time, students saw what development could look like outside the neoliberal frame." Others turned the story into a rallying cry. Youth organizations launched online campaigns to amplify the messages from the documentary. Hashtags like blah, living not loans, and rebuild from below trended briefly on Twitter and Instagram, driven largely by young activists in Africa and the diaspora. A common theme emerged in the discussion threads: disillusionment with traditional aid models. Viewers began questioning the core logic of foreign assistance, especially when tied to extractive conditions during a trade war. Some wondered whether help was truly help if it dismantled education, slashed healthcare, or incited unrest. A European economist joined a live stream to explain how credit downgrades are weaponized against political independence, particularly when countries deviate from market-friendly paths. It's not that these nations are unstable, he said. It's that they're no longer predictable, no longer obeying the script. This comment struck a nerve. Many people began to reinterpret Burkina Faso's experience not as isolation, but as liberation. Rather than see aid suspensions as punishment, some viewed them as a test of national character. And when stories emerged of students tutoring each other, of farmers teaching soil management in makeshift classrooms, of nurses offering care in shuttered hospitals, the global audience didn't just applaud, they wept. These weren't scripted reforms, they were living reforms, honest, difficult, often improvised, but real. Other voices challenged the romanticization of struggle. A few warned against celebrating suffering as a virtue. One African diaspora member wrote, "We shouldn't need to teach under trees or bake bread in clay ovens to prove our resilience."